Mr. Beacon podcast is sponsored by Wiliot, scaling IoT with battery-free Bluetooth.
Welcome to another episode of the Mr. Beacon podcast. This week we're going to be talking about RTLS in healthcare, that's real-time location systems. And we're talking to HT Snowday of Midmark. Welcome to the show, HT.
Thanks, Steve.
Well, cool. I am very glad that you joined us. We spend quite a lot of time looking at technologies, specific individual technologies, and you're really an antidote to that because you work as part of one of the largest organizations that's engaged in healthcare. So you have a very vertically focused, customer-orientated view of this. You have a perspective on what works, what doesn't work, and you work across a broad portfolio of technologies, not just Bluetooth, not just infrared. You look at a whole bunch of them, and you're big enough to be technical and dispassionate about what works where. So lots of good reasons for having this conversation. And I hope out of it we get an insight into this healthcare market, which is one of the strongest for indoor positioning technology and RTLS technology. And I am looking forward to getting your views on the what's good for what and how you use it and a bit about Midmark. Before we launch into that, I just want to give a shout out to the folks at Starbucks. This is not a paid endorsement, but as well as having great coffee and being my office away from home, Starbucks offers this amazing program for kids, adults on the autism spectrum, and provides employment which provides meaning to their lives and some very passionate, really engaged team members who are great for visitors. So I want to thank them for that. My son is one of the kids that's part of that program, and it's meant the world to us. So thanks to Starbucks, and let's get back to you, HT. Perhaps you can start off and just tell us a little bit about what your role is, where in Midmark you fit, and then we'll go back and talk a bit about how this organization that provides the chairs that we lie on in our dentist got into all this crazy technology that you deal with.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I cannot walk away from your intro, Steve. That's wonderful stuff. I love hearing that, and I appreciate you taking the time to call that kind of work and engagement out. That's really cool. So I am HT Snowday with Midmark Corporation, specifically Midmark RTLS, which is the part of the organization focused on real-time locating solutions. I am the Vice President of Innovation and Technology Development, which really means I'm focusing on what we're doing next in the broadest sense. But, relative to RTLS and specifically RTLS in healthcare, I'm an old gray-haired guy in the space. I've been I think my first engagement was in 1995 in a long-term care environment, and the technology has changed. Some of the physics that we have to deal with haven't, which I can talk about that from a perspective that's part of the broad perspective on these kinds of solutions. But importantly, and what's always hooked me is the ability for this technology and this information to have a positive impact on care, on patients, and on caregivers. And that, wonderfully speaking, is part and parcel with part of your implied question about Midmark in the space.
So tell us, how do most people see Midmark? What do you guys do?
Well, Midmark is the enormous company that you all know but don't know. Midmark is over 100 years old, manufacturing discipline in the heartland. Primary operations are in and around the Dayton area in Ohio, and I can provide some more detail. But primarily today, Midmark's business is spread across three different healthcare focus areas: dental, animal health, and medical. In the RTLS space, we're focused on the medical industry, and within the medical space, Midmark has a range of products across the spectrum of things that you need to outfit a clinical environment. And that's a really broad definition. The thing that Midmark is probably most well known for are patient positioning devices, which is a fancy way of describing chairs and tables in a clinic environment. I can assure you that most of the people viewing this podcast and yourself have spent a fair amount of time on a Midmark table at some point. It's a very common component of a clinical environment, but Midmark's product base goes well beyond that. So cabinetry and other ancillary chairs and tables, lighting equipment, diagnostic equipment, which is a very specific technology discipline for the organization. It's fairly comprehensive, or we are fairly comprehensive in our approach to making sure that a clinical environment has the best possible tools available. And it all centers around a fundamental care for improving the patient experience. Mm-hmm. And that's really a wonderful thing about Midmark. I am relatively new to the organization as a whole. While I've been in RTLS for a long time, we joined the organization in 2016. But it's been a very good synergy anchored around what we can do with products and technology to improve the patient experience and improve, in particular, that engagement between the patient and the caregiver.
So we're used to lying on these chairs, tables, having lighting systems and cabinetry. It all like super high quality furniture that's very robust. Looks like it could withstand a missile strike and still be there. But how did Midmark get into the real-time location space? The world of radio technology is quite different to furniture and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly you're right about the heritage of Midmark, but when you look at the strategy, it makes a tremendous amount of sense. Midmark has, historically long had expertise in how do we really well define and improve patient engagement and patient experience. And I mean from a level of technological and scientific and strategic detail, like exactly what is the orientation of the caregiver relative to the patient, and how does that improve the experience? And how can our products fix or maintain issues that may be in that engagement? What are the best kinds of adjustments and environmental conditions that we should have? No. And really approaching solving the problem not from, hey, what's the best individual thing we can make, but what's the best possible environment? And the wonderful thing about that is from that kind of strategic engagement, it's a relatively short leap to say, okay, we're experts at making sure engagement is positive in the room, in the moment of interaction. There is a spectrum of experience for the patient outside the room as well. And RTLS has a lot to say about how you can improve that spectrum of experience, the full patient visit, if you will.
So making that jump, so very holistic view of it, which is good, whereas some of us come from the chip world. You're coming at it from looking at the people that are being cared for. But was this an acquisition or organic creation of a technology team?
Yeah, it was an acquisition. So previously, Midmark RTLS was Versus Technology, relatively well known in the healthcare RTLS space. My history with the organization goes back to its modern inception, which was in the mid-90s. I left the organization for a while, but I came back. I've always been hooked on the ability for the application of technology to make a positive impact. Had some early experiences that were, sort of dramatic and anchoring for me about how this technology can have that kind of an impact. But fundamentally, what the technology is able to do is automate, or at least automate communication of things that are kind of impossible to automate. When you're in a healthcare environment, your primary tool, if you want to compare to manufacturing, any kind of process flow design, your primary tool is a human, and that's kind of difficult to lock down into a process. Your output, which is the product that you're outputting, is another human, or if you will, the positive outcomes for that human. So, you really have to, if you're going to automate that environment, you have to have passive systems that can detect what's going on without requiring any particular path or any particular process or timing. And passive is a difficult word because we're all used to the description of active technology, but it's the passive collection of the information that lets you do these cool things that help out in healthcare.
Yeah, the people in the clinics that you support are busy thinking about things that shouldn't be how technology, that you shouldn't have to get them to do anything. The technology should require really nothing of the user, and every time you do, then there's an opportunity for things to not work. So maybe we should move into some examples and talk about the kind of the categories of offerings that this RTLS umbrella encompasses. I mean, first but let's address the not the elephant in the room, but the tag that's on your collar. What are you wearing there?
So I'm wearing one of our personnel locating badges. This is a hybrid infrared and RF device, meaning it's transmitting infrared and RF. And that's as you said, one of the mechanisms, but the primary mechanism we use to determine location in a healthcare environment. And we have different designs and places of attachment. I'm also wearing one on my wrist right now, which is a silicon band-based system. But as you pointed out before, the real magic is in what you do with the information.
Yeah.
While the technology has changed fundamentally for a long time, one of the advantages of incorporating infrared into our environment is it's well defined by any opaque material, right? So it's also, it doesn't require any kind of algorithms or complexities to provide a focused area. With infrared, we can create relatively small, well-defined zones for locating, and that's really critically important in healthcare because the power in what you're doing is making some assumptions about what is happening, or at least documenting things that you can make assumptions about, like in a clinical environment, a caregiver and a patient have engaged in a patient room. And in fact, early in our history, we created some automation for third-party systems, particularly in the nurse call space, that it was required that you get that information. And it can't really ever be wrong if you're going to run that kind of automation. So historically, we've stuck with the physics of infrared to provide that kind of surety of information, or that, sometimes people refer to it as clinical grade, or hear the term no false positives. That's part of the way in which the platform provides the rock solid information that we get. But then once you have that, the real power is in the software and the analytics and the automation that you provide in the environment, which is a large part of what Midmark RTLS is about.
So just to recap, the infrared technology respects walls and doors and screens. So you pull a screen back and the infrared signal stays within those boundaries. Whereas if you have, say, a Bluetooth beacon that's blasting out at plus 20 dBm, it can penetrate that wall. And so if you're trying to figure out if a patient, a doctor and a nurse are together, then the false positives are, that signal could fluctuate. And if you're just looking at the radio frequency signal rather than the light, then you might get the wrong idea. So why have RF in the tag at all if infrared is so great? So
infrared is great at that part of it, right? But it has other issues inherent in the physics of infrared, which is you can block the signal. You can be in a scenario where you're not receiving infrared in a consistent way. So RF, at a minimum, gives us reliable, constant contact with the badge, right? So status information from the badge. Is the button being pressed? Is it in motion? The kinds of basic telemetry that you want from a device. It also gives us, in a rough sense, location information that you can use to compare or generalize or make exceptions to the kinds of information you're getting from infrared. So we're really complementary. We've always invested in hybrid technology from that perspective for the purpose of getting the best possible location we can. RF, as you said, is the technology continues to develop. There's value there, but ultimately any RF system is somewhat grounded in a statistical reliability, right? Whereas I'm getting this level of granularity at some percentage of reliability at some percentage of time. And with infrared, you kind of throw all that out. Like if I got the signal, the badge is there, and it makes it makes building some of the assumptive stuff we do much easier.
And what kind of RF is there in that tag on your collar?
So we support a few different kinds of RF. This particular tag right now is transmitting RF at 433. We also have a hybrid IR and Wi-Fi based solution that gives us a different kind of RF and a different kind of location that's a Cisco environment compatible device. We're not, relative to the RF channel, it's more about that. Does it serve all of the secondary needs that we have for the system? I shouldn't even say secondary, the complementary needs that we have for the system.
Yeah, so why would you go for Wi-Fi in one case and this 433 band, which is a lower band, so Wi-Fi 2.4 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz, and so 433 is a lot lower. What are the pros and cons of those respective parts of the spectrum for your purposes?
Yeah, so they're really simple reasons. I mean, 433 from a fundamental standpoint, it's an available frequency. It penetrates very well. The lower frequencies you go. It also strikes that balance of it's high enough that you can get a fairly decent amount of communication. It's low enough that it penetrates environments, and you don't need as many receiver points with 433 as you would with a higher frequency like 2.4. On the other hand, Wi-Fi is pretty ubiquitous in environments. So as an RF channel, if we leverage Wi-Fi, do we have to worry about our RF platform penetrating the environment? No. Wi-Fi in healthcare environments, at least these days, is a pretty reliable source of the kind of information that we need. So, it's somewhat environmental dependent for us. But Wi-Fi makes a perfectly acceptable RF channel for our platform.
And will the two continue to just sit side by side? If there's a bunch of Wi-Fi access points, you'll use those. I think you've done a good job of demarcating those two, the strengths and weaknesses of the two, but I'm just trying to think, is there a winner or a loser here?
I think it's environment dependent or solution dependent, okay. Right? So if we're in a smaller clinic environment, the clear winner might be the standardized platform with 433. If you're in a large healthcare environment that already has a clear vision and handle on the capabilities of their Wi-Fi environment, and they can deal with our leveraging some of that bandwidth, we take a very little bit, but it's worthy of analyzing, then the Wi-Fi channel makes sense. But I can certainly describe to you those types of environments where the solution is flip-flopped. I think there's considerations across the board for us there.
Interesting. And so 433, I don't think we've ever talked about that on the almost 100 episodes. So is this an ISM band? You said it's available. It's unlicensed, so you don't have to pay for any telco for using it, correct?
Right. Exactly.
And then what sort of protocol are you using in that piece of bandwidth?
It's a proprietary protocol, our own, and primarily because, again, our needs are, and this would be true for most RTLS vendors, like on the RF channel side, regular, reliable, but relatively small amounts of communication, right? So this isn't a stream of information communicating the kinds of things that an internet or a Wi-Fi channel typically would. In the RF side for RTLS, we need to have insight into secondary things like signal strength and other things that you can use to improve location over RF. But from a communication standpoint, it's small bursts of information.
Interesting. And then any other tools in the toolbox that you use? We've got infrared, we've got Wi-Fi, we've got 433. Are you using Bluetooth today?
We support Bluetooth from an infrastructure standpoint today. So when you deploy one of our systems, we're typically deploying infrared sensors throughout the environment as a way to define our primary locations. We have a variant of that sensor which provides support for a beacon, and that's a fundamentally valuable component for healthcare environments because it serves as a location sensor for our platform. It also provides the ability to create a true powered beacon, since we're providing power at that source for infrastructure systems that might take advantage of static beacon environments.
And what sort of use cases are we talking about in?
So wayfinding primarily, and other kinds of, anytime you want to make the device that is able to locate itself more granular, static beacons in an environment is a typical enabler for that. So wayfinding systems are probably the most common thing, but there are other systems that can take advantage of beacons, other kinds of automation systems. I mean, frankly, Steve, I would ask you that question.
No, it's all about how you're finding it in your vertical, and I do want to actually, let's just flip back briefly to Midmark. Are you at liberty to talk about the number of clinics that and locations that you have your products in? And I'd be interested to know what kind of proportion of those are using your RTLS systems. Is that something you can talk about?
Yeah, I mean, we have looked. Versus prior to Midmark has been in the industry a long time, positioning solutions in healthcare again since 1995. We have over 1,000 licenses out there, so over time, over 1,000 established locations. Some of those are very simple bits of automation, maybe a single nursing unit using it to automate a nurse call system, all the way up to very sophisticated IDN level enterprise implementations with multiple use cases in our software. So there's a lot of variability in the type and size of application in healthcare, but we're certainly, if not the most deployed RTLS in healthcare, one of the most.
Yeah, that's an impressive footprint. And then Midmark as a whole, how many locations roughly? How many clinics?
Midmark as a whole has we'll put it this way, a very dominant footprint in the patient positioning devices, so chairs and tables in a clinic environment. It is difficult to make an estimate, but certainly many of them.
Okay. I'm a market leader, if not the leader in that space.
Definitely the market leader in that space. I think
okay, good. So I just wanted to do that because sometimes we talk to people and they're brilliant, but they're just kind of scratching the surface. And my point here is you guys are in hundreds, over 1,000 locations. And so I think we're very lucky to be able to have this conversation. Let's pivot slightly to the use cases. So I think most people in the business accept healthcare is a great vertical for RTLS and indoor positioning technologies to be used. What are they being used for? Yeah,
sure. That's an excellent question. So I'm trying to think of the right way to order the description of the use cases.
Yeah.
I'll go with what's sort of most commonly recognized. So, asset tracking is the one that most people would recognize. It's also the one that's easiest to contemplate. And there is a true need in healthcare. You have large fleets of high-value clinical devices. I think the prototypical device for asset tracking is the IV pump. Particularly acute care healthcare environments have lots of important devices, but just as an example, large fleets of IV pumps, these are shared devices. They're critically important to the delivery of care. Managing and maintaining them is not only really important for the health of your environment and your patients, but regulated. So, having an understanding of where your fleet of devices are like that, just having that information alone is important. In the asset management world, we can apply different kinds of automation solutions like par leveling or direct management of the kind of deployment you want. So managing the availability and the balance of devices across your enterprise.
And just to interrupt, par leveling, What's par leveling?
Par leveling is the concept that you want to set a particular number of devices for a given unit or a given location. So take a typical nursing unit. My par level for IV pumps is maybe 15 for the unit. And I want to have a certain number available of that 15 at any given time. So there's thresholds that you want to meet. And what is wonderful about using RTLS to manage that is you get real-time information to know if you're ahead or behind of those targets. So I may have a par level for 15 IV pumps on a unit. I fall below it. I'm as low as 13, but I have 5 available, so I'm in a good place. Then suddenly I have 10 on the unit and I have 0 available. Now I'm in a critical state. The idea that as an entity, the healthcare environment can get ahead of that, manage it, deliver new IV pumps to the unit, rebalance IV pumps in the environment before it becomes a truly critical scenario, like I need one and I don't have one. That's really amazing. It also helps dramatically manage the amount of communication required, because in a non-RTLS environment, this becomes more of a feeling. Or I'm using, ad hoc location management. I've got a clean utility and a soiled utility, and the clean utility looks low, but I really don't know what's going on. I'm going to make a call down to biomedical engineering to get some more IV pumps without having a true scientific sense of what's going on in the environment. So par leveling is an amazing application for asset management.
Great. And others? Other applications?
So, the other applications from our perspective all relate to the management of people and primarily patients in the environment. So there are simple examples of that. One of the things that we have done historically very well throughout the history of the organization is nurse call automation. So acute care environments have a requirement to provide the ability for patients to contact caregivers. And that is the genesis of a nurse call system, goes all the way back to using bells to call for a nurse. But a modern nurse call system is a fairly sophisticated platform that allows the patient to press a button, call for a caregiver. Usually in nurse call environments, multiple things happen, like lights light up in the corridor, notifications happen at the central nurses station. Most modern systems have the ability for patients and caregivers to communicate in some form, but what is required is closing the call, and frequently it's required for the caregiver to go into the room, attend to the patient, and document that they've responded to the call in the room, which is usually as simple as pressing a button on a wall, which sounds like something that you wouldn't actually need to automate. But in reality, there are many, many scenarios where caregivers have to deal with the patient first. And you can imagine a patient in some distress, the last thing on a caregiver's mind is dealing with canceling the nurse call event. It's caring for the patient. So getting accurate, reliable documentation of caregivers responding to calls is something that can be done by RTLS. And we've long been a partner to nurse call companies for that particular use case. From my perspective, though, the most powerful kind of use case that we engage in revolves around workflow processes in a clinical process. So in an environment where you're putting the patient through some kind of standardized process. And it can be as simple as I'm getting a patient to a room, I'm engaging with them with different types of caregivers, and I'm sending them home in, say, a primary care setting, all the way to very sophisticated environments of providing treatment and care like an oncology clinic, where multiple stages of care happen in a given period of time. And getting it right and getting the timing right is really critical across the board, both from optimizing, valuable resources you're providing to the patient as well as valuable pharmaceuticals. Our system can provide both tremendous operational insight and retrospective analysis of exactly what you're doing in that environment. So allowing you to put a patient through that kind of process with less wait, more engagement is in my mind where we really make a difference in terms of making things better for patients and caregivers in a clinical environment.
What about the check-in process? I can't, the number of times I have this vision of the doctor who's kind of waiting to see the patient, but then there's this big line of people and some harried receptionist who's not, who's the bottleneck in that system. Is there any progress in automating that?
Yes, appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. Self-rooming as a concept is something that many of our clinics take advantage of, and the idea here is that there's multiple things wrong with waiting and queuing for care. Among them, simply it's a waste of space. Right, a waiting room is non-value add, non-treatment space. And so to minimize that square footage, if you will, from an architectural and strategic analysis standpoint, it's really important. So we have helped pioneer the concept of allowing patients to go straight to an exam room. And the reason that RTLS can provide resources to make that effective is because you imagine the flow of a patient comes in, checks with registration, you're provided a real-time locating badge and directed to go to an exam room. And the premise here is that if patients, if people are able to find their own hotel room, they can find their own exam room, right? Mm-hmm. So you also, frequently a self-rooming environment is paired with an on-stage, off-stage concept for clinical care, which is to say the exam rooms typically have multiple entrances, one from the offstage area, which is where the clinical staff work, and the onstage area where the patients can come in and get to their exam room. So a patient comes in, has a real-time locating badge, goes straight to their exam room as they've been directed by registration staff. Now, the issue is, how does everyone who needs to orchestrate the delivery of care know what's going on? And with an RTLS system, that's made very straightforward. So notifications and screens that identify, okay, a patient has just arrived in this room. We frequently deliver the concept of documenting alone time, which is how long have I left the patient alone in a care area, right? The timer starts the moment they hit there. Minimizing that alone time is really important because it's important to, obviously, the perception of care from the patient's perspective, but it's also really important to maximize the utility of that clinical space, right? When you're leaving the patient alone in clinical space, you're not using what is frequently a very expensive bit of real estate to create. Yeah. So using an RTLS to drive a process, or at least notify staff of where you are in the process, is really important to making that process as effective and efficient as possible. I'll stop. I could talk about this all day long and the different steps in a
Yeah,
clinic.
yeah, it's fascinating. I am convinced that if clinics would adopt all of the things we've talked about, our lives would be better, the costs would be lower, the wait times would be lower, patients would be happier, doctors would be less frustrated. Tell me a bit about where the momentum is in adopting these technologies, because it all sounds great. Why don't we have 100% penetration, and where are the reasons to be happy? Where are the biggest trends in terms of adoption of some of these applications that we've just been talking about?
Well, I think there's a lot of different moving parts to this in healthcare, right? So, by the way, I completely agree with you. This is something that every clinic environment should do, and certainly. Both from personal experience and anecdotal experience from patients in a highly automated environment, driven by RTLS, are much, much better. I think, reasons to be happy are probably the best place for me to go. There's a few things going on in healthcare in general, and one of them is a move to clinics in general, right? So you have the historical concept of I go to a hospital to get care. Well, other types of healthcare technology and other improvements in treatment have made it possible to deliver care, to put it bluntly, between 8 and 5. Yeah. And that's a much more efficient mode to deliver care. It's actually much better for the patient in many ways. Better outcomes if you have the patient going home for recovery, but you've got to have the type of care that can be handled between 8 and 5. Well, that world is expanding. So you have, surgery centers and oncology centers and even cardiac treatment centers that are doing things now between 8 and 5 that, 10 years ago and certainly 20 years ago, you wouldn't have even possibly considered. So what that does is it makes the clinic environment much more important to get right and much more sophisticated compared to, primary care. I'm going to visit my doctor about not feeling well, as opposed to I'm going to come in and I'm going to get a catheterization, or I'm going to get some kind of chemotherapy treatment through an IV. Getting those intervals of care right is really important. I think that's driving the adoption of this in a clinical environment fairly materially. So that kind of change and focus in healthcare, I think, is really an important part of raising the visibility of this kind of solution, which, again, isn't necessarily what people think of initially. But the healthcare industry is getting smarter. They're getting more educated. There's certainly more of this out there. The momentum is very high relative to solutions like this, and we're certainly really excited about the future.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, hospitals are kind of dangerous places. You don't want to be spending any more time there than necessary. So I can see, and I see it myself, people having amazing eye surgery and they're in and they're out. And if you can optimize that, then that's going to create huge value, huge savings, better experience for people. So you guys are doing good work, and congratulations on all these amazing solutions. It's been great hearing about them. Appreciate you dipping into the technology, but also relating it back to things that we can all relate to as people that are going through this system. So HT, thanks very much for your time.
Steve, brilliant. Thank you.
We have this tradition, which is we talk a little bit about you personally and your music taste, just to get things going, and then that gets transposed to the end. It's a real test of whether someone actually watches the podcast, if they even know that we talk about music, because I think most people don't get that far. But it's one of my favorite parts.
Your intro said that we were going to talk about the books we take to Mars.
Oh, the books.
I was prepared for that. But
okay.
I'll do that ad hoc.
I thought it was the music, but actually we've never done books. So what are the books that you would take to Mars? That's a really interesting question.
So I have to ask, is it music that you would take to Mars? Is it like the 3 albums?
It's normally music. but
Maybe
we did paintings once because the CEO of Estimote doesn't listen to music, and so we did paintings once. Why not do books once? Let's do books.
Well, so wait. I would like to try the music because I think I would take probably take Dark Side of the Moon. That's getting a little old. I would take an Aaron Copland compilation of some sort, which I know is completely different, but classical.
Can you be specific? Is there a specific piece that would have to be there?
Rodeo would have to be there. Fan for the Common Man would have to be there. Billy the Kid would have to be there. Outside of those three, and those are the most popular Aaron Copland tunes as it is. Maybe Lincoln.
Right.
I think I'd like to have that on there as well. That would be a good bit for me.
Okay. Very good.
That there are others, but yeah. Those two come easy. After that, there's a lot of conflict in my mind. I would maybe take a Billy Joel album or compilation.
Right. And is there any particular, as I would say, Billy Joel album? There's a whole Jim Gaffigan sketch. If you haven't heard it, it's hilarious. He talks about how people in Ireland and actually England say Billy Joel, and but anyway, we won't go there. But is there a memory or a time in your life that a Billy Joel album kind of conjures up?
Oh, sure, high school. I mean, just constant replay of greatest hits albums and
42nd Street, is it? I can't remember the albums, but there's the Breaking Glass one. That was
yeah.
That was good.
Yep. That's a little early. I was probably into in high school would have been later. So the I can't remember the Good Night Saigon album, which I think maybe it is Good Night Saigon. In any case, or not Good Night Saigon. Now we're getting into show tunes. What was the name of that album with? See, here's the problem, is iTunes has destroyed my context to albums because I listen to the music, but no longer have an association with the vinyl that I used to have. It's
a tragedy, really. I think that's probably why vinyl seems to be coming back. I love that resurgence because it appeals to those of us that grew up in that time, but it's a package. It's more than just the music. It's you're buying an expression of something that goes beyond just sound, and so yeah. I use Spotify, and I just love the fact I can listen to anything. But then you just don't have that package. The thing that you get when you see the Bohemian Rhapsody cover and you open it up and you have all the photos, and Apple tried to recreate that once, didn't they? But it just didn't go anywhere.
Well, and it's interesting too because licensing kind of makes some of that stuff come and go. Like I've noticed that which album or which production a particular song or piece of music is pulled from seems to change from time to time. I don't claim to understand it. There is a neat little restaurant in town where they've done the walls explicitly in, I have to say, largely 70s albums, and it's brilliant and open. So not necessarily the cover of the album, but the infold, which is just, it's awesome because there's some really creative material in those albums that are.
Yeah, you look back at the Yes albums. Captain Fantastic from Elton John was just an awesome piece of artwork on the album. Many examples of that. Very good. Well, thanks, HT. Appreciate that insight into your taste.